The trunk of a white Lexus pops open next to Gray's Papaya, a famous hot dog store on 6th Avenue and 8th Street in Manhattan, and for a second it looks like a drug deal. It isn't. It's a record sale, one of the only ways he could get his music into people's hands. Inside, cassette tapes, shrink-wrapped, stacked like ammunition. No record label logo, no distributor, no radio push. Just a rapper named Jay-Z, a couple of buddies, a car, and a hustle after being turned down by major labels in New York City. He doesn't wait for the industry to let him in. He builds another way in. By day, he's driving up and down the East Coast, college campuses, mom and pop record stores, anywhere someone might hand over cash for a tape nobody else was selling. By night, he was back in the studio, recording an album that the labels who passed on him will regret skipping out on. The beginning wasn't glamorous. Before the chains, the champagne, the wealth, the whole operation fit in a trunk. The industry's rejection wasn't just an obstacle. It became a blueprint. Because what got built at the back of that trunk didn't just launch an album, it launched a model, one where artists could own the machine instead of just working inside it. A model that would become the foundation of Roc-A-Fella Records. DJ Clark Kent had heard something. A producer who worked also as an A&R consultant for Atlanta Records. He brought a young Brooklyn's rapper's music to the label's table, convinced he'd found the next voice of New York hip-hop. Atlantic passed, Columbia passed too. By the mid-90s, Sean Carter, also known as Jay-Z, had done the circuit. Freestyle features, a stint touring with Big Daddy Kane. He had built a reputation among people who already knew hip-hop. He hadn't built one among the people who signed the checks. The reasons cited over the years point to mismatch more than dismissal. A voice and a subject matter that didn't fit the lane labels were investing in during the stretch of the mid-90s. Whether it was the content of his lyrics or simply the crowded field, the labels weren't convinced this particular rapper was the next signing worth betting on. He'd later described the pattern bluntly, label after label telling him the same thing: you're not the guy. There was one thread that almost held. A short-lived deal with Payday Records produced early singles, but disagreements over their arrangement eventually pushed Carter away from the label. That decision is easy to romanticize now. At the time, it wasn't a bold entrepreneurial pivot. It was a rapper with no label, no deal, and no guaranteed path, betting on himself because nobody else would. That bet needed a name and an office, and two people who believed the math would eventually work. He already knew exactly who to call. There wasn't a marketing budget, no promotional run, no street team paid plaster posters through Brooklyn and beyond. There was a car, 3 men, and a trunk full of product. The math was brutally simple. Every tape they sold themselves was one more sale without a middleman taking a cut. Every cassette and CD sold outside Gray's Papaya on a college campus or in a mom and pop record store on some overlooked block put money directly back into the hustle that existed to make it, Roc-A-Fella. Before it had an office, before it had a logo, before it was much more than 3 names and a handshake. Damon Dash became the chief relationship builder, working record store owners, radio DJs, and anyone with a foothold in a market the major labels weren't watching closely enough to notice someone else moving in. Biggs Burke kept the operation moving, the inventory, the numbers, the unglamorous math of how many units moved and where, and Jay-Z was the product and the pitch, behind the wheel as often as he was behind the mic. This wasn't a metaphor for hustle, it was the actual business model. Every sale did more than move another tape. It financed the next batch. Press the tapes, load the trunk, drive to wherever buyers were, blast their music as loud as they could, and sell the tapes one at a time. The industry had a term for what labels tried to do with new artists: break them. Nobody was going to break Jay-Z into anything. So the 3 of them built the market out themselves, one trunk, one street corner, one open car door at a time. By the time major labels started paying attention, there were already sales figures they couldn't ignore. Numbers moving unit by unit, outside the system that was supposed to decide which record succeeded. 3 names, 1 company, no consensus on the exact date it became official. Depending on which account you read, it was either 1994, 95, or 96. What's not disputed is what it was named: Roc-A-Fella, a deliberate echo of Rockefeller, one of the wealthiest family names in American history, borrowed by 3 men from Brooklyn and Harlem with no capital, no distributor, and no guarantee the name would outlast the first pressing run. It wasn't a joke, it was a thesis statement, the kind of audacity that only makes sense in retrospect once it works. The trunk sales had proven something the labels hadn't believed. There was demand. What they didn't have was the infrastructure to meet it at scale, pressing plants, retail relationships beyond what they could work by hand. sold, a way to get product into stores that weren't mom and pop. So they went looking for a distributor, not a label willing to sign them. The difference mattered more than it sounds. Most artists spent years trying to get signed. Roc-A-Fella was trying to stay unsigned for as long as they could without limiting its reach. They didn't need someone to discover Jay-Z anymore. They needed someone to move boxes. That was an unusual position for an unsigned rap act. Most artists need a label to create demand. Roc-A-Fella had already created demand. Now it needed infrastructure. A traditional record deal would have meant giving up ownership or long-term control of the masters, the actual asset, in exchange for someone else fronting the money. For Roc-A-Fella, a distribution deal meant someone else handled getting the records into stores while the company kept its independence and its masters. It wasn't complete independence. Distribution still meant relying on someone else's network, but it preserved the one thing Dash, Burke, and Carter increasingly understood was worth protecting: ownership. Priority Records agreed to distribute Reasonable Doubt. For a company that had started with a trunk full of tapes, it was the first time the business had access to national pipeline instead of a backseat of a Lexus. It wasn't a random bet. Priority had built a reputation that decade working with independent rap labels, and would soon become known for another landmark partnership with Master P's No Limit Records. Roc-A-Fella wasn't the only outsider betting that ownership was worth more than an advance. It was one of several proving the model could work. June 25, 1996, Reasonable Doubt hit shelves. The album three men had bet a company's existence on. It sold roughly 43,000 copies in its first week, enough to land at number 23 on the Billboard 200. Not enough to make anyone in the industry stop what they were doing. Context matters here. That same year, Tupac's All Eyes on Me sold more than 500,000 copies in its first week. Jay-Z's debut would take years to reach platinum. It wouldn't be certified platinum until 2002, 6 years after it dropped, but the first week numbers don't measure what critics were hearing. The production credits alone read like a rap pedigree. DJ Premier, Clark Kent, Ski, and the guest list included the notorious B.I.G., already one of the defining voices in New York hip-hop, in the same New York scene that had passed on Jay-Z entirely. Reasonable Doubt wasn't competing with Biggie. It was standing beside him on the same record, signaling that the respect inside hip-hop had arrived before the commercial success did. The commercial payoff was slow. The critical respect wasn't. Its stories were quieter than many of its contemporaries, less about spectacle than calculation, consequence, and survival. Word moved through the culture the way that word had always moved for Roc-A-Fella, not through radio and not through a marketing budget, but person to person, the same way the tapes had moved out of that trunk. It's tempting to say the industry finally recognized what it had missed. That's not quite accurate. What actually happened is less dramatic and more instructive. An album with modest first week numbers slowly became one of the most influential debuts in hip-hop history, not because a gatekeeper changed their mind, but because the audience never needed permission to decide for itself. Quick interruption. According to YouTube at the time I'm editing this video, 128.5% of the watch time on my Def Jam documentary came from people who aren't subscribed. I have absolutely no idea how that's possible, but if you're one of those people, I'd really appreciate it if you would subscribe. I post a new documentary every Thursday at 2 p.m, and if you enjoy stories about businesses and empires behind music, fashion, and culture, you'll probably like what's coming next. Alright, back to the story. By the late 90s, Roc-A-Fella was becoming more than a record label. It was becoming an ecosystem, and the trunk sale instinct hadn't disappeared, it had just scaled. But scaling had a cost. In June 1997, Def Jam acquired a 50% stake in Roc-A-Fella, shifting distribution from Priority to Def Jam in the process. It wasn't a desperate move. The label was already generating real revenue, but it was the first time the company they built from a trunk no longer belonged entirely to them. In exchange, they got major label muscle, bigger budgets, wider reach, and a partner who could put Jay-Z's next album in stores nationwide, not just wherever Dash could drive. In 1999, the founders used the platform to launch Rocawear. It wasn't a licensing deal or celebrity endorsement. It was an extension of the same principle that started the whole thing. Don't rent your name to somebody else's business model. Build the business, keep the equity, at least the half they still controlled. The roster grew alongside it. Beanie Siegel, Freeway, Memphis Bleak, Cameron, a young Chicago producer named Kanye West, who spent years making beats for other people's records before anyone signed him as as an artist in his own right. Roc-A-Fella wasn't just releasing Jay-Z albums anymore. It was assembling a roster that could one day stand on more than a single star, even if Jay-Z remained its center of gravity. None of this happened by accident, and none of it happened without friction. What had started as a record label had grown into a broader business with clothing, new artists, and ventures beyond music. As the company expanded, so did the complexity, and the three founders were beginning to pull in different directions. What started in a trunk had now become something closer to a conglomerate, half owned by the very industry that once turned it away. The question was no longer whether the model worked, it was whether three people could keep steering the half they had left in the same direction. In 2004, Roc-A-Fella's remaining ownership stake moved to Island Def Jam, bringing the company fully under the major label umbrella. Combined with the 1997 sale, the total value of what started in a trunk had been fully absorbed into a major label, the same industry that once decided Jay-Z wasn't worth signing. The terms of that final sale weren't equal in every sense. In 2004, Jay-Z was named president and CEO of Def Jam Recordings, elevated from artist to executive inside the very system Roc-A-Fella had been built to route around. Dash and Burke exited Roc-A-Fella as the company was absorbed into the new Def Jam structure. For fans, the breakup felt less like the end of a business partnership than the end of an era. Roc-A-Fella had come to represent more than a label. It was a shared ambition built by three men who had betted on each other when nobody else would. Watching that vision unravel in public made the success story feel strangely incomplete. The friction between Dash and Carter had been building for years before it came official. Different instincts, different appetites for risk, different ideas about what success was supposed to look like. Neither man has ever offered a single agreed upon account of exactly where it broke. What's harder to argue with is what happened afterwards. Jay-Z chose to operate inside one of the industry's biggest institutions. Dash spent the years that followed trying to build new ones. Neither path erased what they built together. For a brief moment, three people who had been shut out of the music industry created one of the most powerful independent movements in music. In the end, Roc-A-Fella proved something bigger than whether Jay-Z would become a superstar. It proved an artist could build a company instead of waiting to be discovered by one. The irony is that the success demanded compromises the founders never had to make when all they owned was a trunk full of tapes. By the time Roc-A-Fella disappeared into Def Jam, the blueprint had already escaped it. Independent ownership, artist entrepreneurship, fashion, film, equity, those ideas outlived the label that helped popularize them. The company was gone, the model wasn't. Hi, you made it to the end of the video, so let me make you an offer you can't refuse. You hit that little red subscribe button and I'll keep telling the stories behind the world's most iconic brands every Thursday at 2. Deal? Perfect. Thanks for watching and have a great day, and I'll see you next week.